Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at government interventions into the supply and demand market. What that really means is we're going to look at what happens when the government imposes price controls like maximums and minimums, when they intervene with per unit taxes or per unit subsidies, quotas, which are quantity maximums, and then finally we'll talk about tariffs, which are taxes on imports. Let's get started. So to start off with, we're going to look at price ceilings and price floors, which are two types of what are called price controls. You've probably heard of like maybe caps on when the government might come in and say, after a hurricane, you're not allowed to sell bottled water or generators for really, really high prices. That would be an example of a price ceiling. Rent control in New York City would be another example of a price ceiling where the government says you can't charge more than a certain amount of rent. What we're going to find is that they will benefit some, but not all of the buyers who, because you're going to pay a lower price, but they're going to create shortages. And as a result, some of the buyers are going to leave unhappy, not with the good. And then we're also going to hurt all of the sellers for the good because some of them aren't going to be able to sell. And some of them are going to only be able to sell for this lower price that the price ceiling is allowing for. So we're going to first draw just supply and demand. And we're going to want to leave ourselves a little bit of space down here because we're going to label some things down with that. And we have supply and demand, and we want to include a equilibrium amount. So we're going to just say Q star and P star. And a price ceiling is only effective when it's set below the equilibrium price. And so we're going to set that down here. If it's up here, it just doesn't do anything. So we would say that it's not binding or it doesn't have any effect. If, for example, we told everybody that you could only transact at most for $300, right? And that's some number up here, but people are already trading down here at P star at maybe $100, then that $300 price ceiling isn't going to do anything. So only price ceilings set below are actually going to have an effect. Now, what we're going to find is that because the quantity supplied is low at PC, at that price ceiling value, we would say that the number of transactions is going to fall to QS. That's the number that are actually going to get produced. But at that very low price, there's actually a fairly large amount of quantity demanded. And as a consequence of that, the distance between these, you have some people who want it, but they're not actually selling that many units. And so we have what's called a shortage. And so those buyers, right, those are the ones that are kind of left out in the cold. Now, obviously, these buyers, these people right here, they actually didn't obtain the good originally. You got to think about like an original supply and demand graph. Only these buyers from here are actually the ones from here to here are actually really hurt by it, because those are the buyers that used to get the product, but now they're not because we have a lower quantity supplied. Now, all of the sellers are going to be hurt because they get a lower price. But in addition, you have these sellers right here who are actually being hurt because they're not able to make a sale anymore. So these people from QS to Q star, they used to make sales at P star, and now they're not. Now, the sellers down here, these people, boop, 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 those people are all also harmed because PC is less than P star. So it harms all the sellers, benefits some of the buyers, and it creates shortages. Now, we're going to take a look at price floors, and it's going to be a similar phenomena, but with a price floor, that's a minimum price. So we're going to say that in order for that one to be effective, the only way we'd have an effective price floor is if it's actually set above what that equilibrium value would be. So again, it's just a minimum amount that we can transact at. Lots of examples of those. For example, minimum wages, right? If instead of price, we said wage, a minimum wage says, even if you're willing to work for $3 an hour and the business is willing to pay you $3 an hour, the U.S. federal government says, no, you can only work for $7.25 an hour, right? That's the federal minimum wage. And it might even be higher than that in other states. Now, as a consequence of that, the amount of quantity demanded is going to be fairly low, right, at that high price. So the quantity demanded is going to be low. There's less amount of people that are willing to be able to spend that amount. And at the same time, there's a whole lot of quantity supplied. And so we have this kind of additional phenomena where now there's a whole bunch being supplied and not very much being demanded, and we call that a surplus. And this is also inefficient, right? It's kind of a waste of our resources to generate units that aren't actually going to be bought. Now, it's going to benefit some, but not all the sellers. And we can think about who's actually benefiting here, because these sellers, the first ones in the line, those people are benefiting because they're going to get to sell their product for PF instead of P star. But after quantity demanded, after this quantity right here, these sellers, those people right here are not actually making any benefits because they're no longer able to transact. right? They used to be able to find some buyers in this lower part of the demand curve, but these sellers are actually being harmed by it. So not all sellers are helped by this price floor. Another way to think about it is also that all of the buyers are harmed. Well, how is that true? Well, all the buyers who are able to buy are now paying PF. That's these people on the demand curve. So these people are paying a higher price than they used to. But in addition, there's these people right here on the demand curve who actually can't get the good at all because the price is too high for them, right? They could, but they aren't willing to pay that high price. So these buyers are harmed because they're not even going to get the product whatsoever, despite the fact that there's a huge surplus of it. Now, let's take a look at other types of interventions where they're actually going to affect the costs of production. These are what we call per unit taxes and per unit subsidies. And on these, we're going to see that it ends up kind of driving a wedge between what the buyer pays and what the seller gets to keep. Now, normally we would say you've got Q star transactions and P star price. And if we imposed a per unit tax, it's going to shift the supply curve vertically up in the amount of the tax. And we know that up is really actually just a decrease, right? So it says decrease supply, but this vertical shift up, the vertical distance between these two, is the amount of the tax. And it's the per unit, we should be clear, the per unit amount of the tax is this vertical distance between these two. Because all it's doing is saying now it costs a little bit more to produce. Now, the effect of this, we have a new equilibrium, is to reduce the quantity, right? So our quantity goes down to QT, and it's going to drive up the price that the buyers pay. So I'm going to put PB right there. So the buyers are going to pay this new higher price, but the tax is the vertical distance between that buyer price and the original supply curve. And so actually the sellers only get to keep PS that I'm going to label right here. And why does the buyer pay more than what the seller gets to keep? Well, it's because there's a per unit tax, right? And so you could actually say it's the vertical between here and here. It's also the vertical between PB and PS. It's the same vertical distance throughout this range, right? Between ST and S. So even if I've not drawn it exactly the same, there it is. So you can always find that. Now, it also is going to create some tax revenue. We'll talk more in another lesson about what that's going to look like. But usually taxes are used to either decrease the quantity of something or generate some money for the government. Now let's take a look at what would happen with a subsidy. And this one's going to be a little bit tricky for some folks. For this one, we've got supply and demand and a quantity Q star and a P star value. And a subsidy is actually just going to shift the supply curve vertically down, right? S sub in the amount of that subsidy. So it's exactly the same process, but it's just shifting it down. And this one's going to be kind of wackadoo, right? We've got the new equilibrium here. This is the quantity with the subsidy. And here's what's crazy. This is the price the buyer pays. And how do I know that? It's because it's from the demand curve. So this is the price the buyer pays, and there's a per unit amount of subsidy. And that subsidy is up here. The amount is the vertical, right? So we kind of go back up to that original supply curve, and we go over from that original supply curve right here. That's actually how much the sellers get to keep. So how much is the subsidy? Well, it's the distance between the two. The per unit amount of the subsidy is between PS and PB. And you can see actually it's the same concept kind of on both sides here. PB is higher than PS is higher than PB. And that's because the subsidy and the tax respectively are driving a wedge in between those two prices. Now, this obviously increases the quantity. It's going to cost the government money to do that, but it's going to help both the buyers and the sellers out because the buyers are going to pay a lower price than P star and the sellers are going to get to receive a higher price than P star. So obviously both buyers and sellers love it, but it does cost the government money. And later on, we're going to look at another reason why we might want to consider that other options. Now, or at least other costs of that particular that decision. Let's take a look at our last two, tariffs and quotas. So tariffs in this class are going to refer to per unit taxes on imports. And it's not going to affect our domestic supply curve. So I'm just going to write D-DOM for domestic supply and domestic demand, right? S-DOM, D-DOM. That means that these are our domestic, our in-country producers. And if this country only transacted with itself, you'd have Q star and P star as the price. But imagine a world maybe where there was a supply and where the price of it in the rest of the world was much lower, right, than what P star is. So whatever this good is, maybe the rest of the world can produce it for a whole lot cheaper. And so the way we model that is we actually draw this horizontal line here and we say world price. And what that says is that really the world price is below what this market is going to transact at. So these people, the domestic buyers, can actually buy from the rest of the world at this cheap, low price. So what they're going to do is, well, they're going to buy this much, quantity demanded. And domestically, well, they're not able to compete with that world price. Only this much is going to be domestically supplied, QS. And so this amount, this huge amount right here, is imports, right? That's how much we import. Now, what a tariff will do is it's going to shift up that world price, just like we have a per unit tax. It's going to shift it up in the amount of the tariff. So if we said, for example, there was like a $2 tax, well, it would be world price plus the tariff. And so that would be just shifting this curve up by 2. Now, the effect of that is to make a few of these domestic sellers a little bit more competitive. So now, and this is going to get a little bit tight in here, I'm going to say QS1. That's the new amount, and I should probably put it right down here, but that's okay. It's the new amount that actually we're going to be able to produce because the world is a little bit more expensive. If I want to buy from the world, I have to pay $2 more. So there's a few, these sellers right here, who are domestic sellers who are now able to enter the market. Now, we have fewer buyers at that higher price. So we go to move back up here. This is the new amount that the buyers are willing and able to buy, QD1. So what it's going to also do is shrink our imports. So this is the imports in after the tax, right? So we have imports pre-tax, and then it's going to shrink those imports down such that it's going to be a little bit less that we're buying from the rest of the world. So again, it's going to reduce our imports. It's going to help these domestic sellers. It's actually going to help all of them because all of the domestic sellers can now can compete at WP plus T, but it's going to harm all of our buyers, right? Because they're going to pay more than what that world price would be. Now we're going to take a look at quotas. They're actually much easier than tariffs. We saved kind of the easy one for last. A quota is a quantity maximum. So a quantity maximum just means that we aren't going to be allowed to transact all the way over here at Q star. Instead, the government's going to come along and say, this is the maximum quantity, and that's the quota, right? Now, the quota is going to lead to the buyers paying a very high price because the demand curve intercepts this quantity at a fairly high price. That's because these people, the first few people who are willing and able to obtain the product, they value it so highly that that's actually their price they're willing to pay for that quantity. And so as a consequence, all of these sellers, the ones right here, all the way up to the quantity, they're able to charge, instead of P star, they can charge that price that the buyer is willing to pay, which is a much higher price. Now, some of the sellers, these sellers right here, the second group, they're not happy because the quota locked them out of that market. So the second kind of group, this group from here all the way up to here, those sellers are not benefited. And this is harming all of the buyers, right? Obviously, the first few buyers from here all the way over to the quantity, these people on the line, I should be a little bit less smushy with that. These people on the line are paying a higher price, but these people on the line with the little dash marks, those people aren't going to obtain the product at all. So it is going to harm all of the buyers because some of them are paying higher prices and some of them are locked out of the market. It's also going to harm some of the sellers, but it's going to really favor the ones who are able to sell. So hopefully this helped you understand some of the consequences of using government interventions in supply and demand. I'll see you next time.